substitution being taught. So God wants his people to know and understand that through the substitution of another, they can be saved. Through all of these stories, or a large percentage of them, God wants the people to understand the penalties of sin. You see that one in all of them? And the penalties of sin, of course, are to be banished and to die. Sin brings banishment and death. And so I think the central theme of all of the stories is this concept of the two penalties for sins, death and banishment, and the concept that substitution is possible to save us from these penalties. And so what I propose is that the atonement reverses the fall. If this is a temple ritual, the goal of the temple ritual is to return to the Holy of Holies, to return to the Garden of Eden, to return to the Tree of Life, and to undo the effects of the fall. And if the effects of the fall are sin and death, then we need some vehicle to undo sin and death. And the two goats represent this undoing of sin and death. And so if I can say this without being blasphemous or misrepresented, the two goats don't represent, or the scapegoat does not represent either Christ or the devil. It represents something more fundamental. Now that's where I need to be careful. There's nothing more fundamental than Christ. But Christ died for a reason. He died in order to overcome the penalties of sin and death that came upon us because of the fall. And so the goats are designed to teach us about the two fundamental sins, penalties for sin, spiritual death and physical death. And that's why there's two of them instead of one of them in the Babylonian version. In the Israelite version, they separated the goat into two halves instead of one in the Babylonian version, in order to separate these concepts and make very clear the concepts of sin and death. And inasmuch as the scapegoat represents the devil, or has things in common with the devil, it's because the devil was cast out of heaven, suffering spiritual death because of his sins. And inasmuch as the scapegoat has things in common with Christ, it's because Christ suffered the penalties of spiritual death for us when he was forsaken upon the cross, so he turned to the presence of God and not be forever cast out from God's presence. And so, of course, there are things that the scapegoat has in common with the devil. And of course, there are things that the scapegoat has in common with Christ, because its purpose of the scapegoat ritual is to teach us, again, something slightly more fundamental, these concepts of spiritual and physical death that Christ takes for us. And I do have time for maybe 3 questions or so. I've got 3 minutes, right? Are there any questions? Yeah.
How do you then go back to what you started with, the names that are given to each of the goats, and reconcile that with what you're telling me?
Okay, that's a really good question. The problem, of course, is no one knows exactly what the name Azazel means. The name Azazel it could be a name for the devil, and one of the evidences for that is that it shows up in the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch most think is a pretty late apocryphal, pseudepigraphal text. It could have been deriving that from the scapegoat, not the other way around. And what that means is some Jewish people in the days of the Book of Enoch thought that the scapegoat was connected with the devil. And we don't even know that Azazel is a name of a demon. Now, it could be. There is some decent evidence for that apart from Enoch. But even so, if God is trying to teach us this concept, remember, there are things about the scapegoat that he has engineered in order to allow us to see spiritual death in it. And of course, Azazel, if that's a name for the devil, it's the name specifically for a wilderness or a demon of the air, we think, and a demon representing, or a name of a demon that presides over this concept of banishment. So what we have is a goat chosen for the Lord, to represent the Lord, no doubt there, and another goat chosen to represent banishment, or the devil who was banished, or anything you want to do there. And so I don't think that the name necessarily implies that we have to see it as the devil. We can see it as the penalty the devil took upon himself. I don't know if I did a very good job there, but over here. Oh, okay. Yes. Well, I had that on my list, I didn't think I didn't think the two halves were the two penalties for sin. Now, that's possible, but I never thought that. And the reason I didn't associate it with that, well, it's possible, is I think there's a more probable interpretation, and that is when you don't make a covenant in Hebrew, you cut one, karat berit, and often we will show the penalties for breaking the. Now it is connected with penalties. The penalties for breaking a covenant are often illustrated in the way you make the covenant. So Abraham, in making this covenant, cuts an animal in half, places the two pieces on either side, passes between the halves, and says. By the way, that's also more connected to passing between the two mountain halves on the Mount of Olives, or between the two mountain halves at Shechem. And so once he passes between these two halves, he says, "May I be slain." And so I think there's a representation of physical death here. I'm not sure spiritual death is represented. It is a penalty for sin, but it may not be represented in that covenant, because it looks to me like, yes, there are two halves, but the only point here is we're killing the animal. So the animal is killed, and Abraham says, may my life be taken if I don't keep my covenant that I've made with you this day. Although it's not Abraham, it's not Abraham that passes between the halves, it's the Lord, which that's important, I should have said, because the Lord is saying, I would rather die than break my covenant with you, Abraham. That's a very moving moment when the Lord takes that role. Right.
Thanks. Thank you, James.